Picture this. 3 billion people across the globe claim to follow the same God, trace their lineage to the same ancient patriarch, and revere many of the same prophets. Yet they're divided into separate faiths that have fought wars, built walls, and drawn lines in the sand for centuries. How does that happen? How do you start with one man, one faith, one message, and end up with Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all claiming to be the true path?
First of all, thank you for choosing to spend these moments with me and with religion as it is. I know that, like me, you are interested in discovering and discussing those topics that seem to be hidden within our religions. Respecting all, we can talk about each one. If the topic interests you, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and turn on notifications to be alerted of all new videos posted. Thank you so much.
Today, we're going to unravel one of history's most fascinating puzzles. We're going back 4,000 years to a man named Abraham who changed the course of human civilization forever. But here's what nobody talks about. If Abraham truly followed one unified faith, why didn't it stay that way? What happened between then and now that fractured his followers into 3 distinct religions? And more importantly, which group actually represents what Abraham originally believed? This isn't just ancient history. This question affects how 3 billion people understand their faith today. It shapes global politics, drives international conflicts, and determines how entire nations view each other. The answer will challenge everything you thought you knew about these 3 religions. Because when you trace the family tree of faith back to its roots, what you discover is both shocking and surprisingly simple. But before we dive in, let me tell you why this matters right now. In our world today, religious differences fuel conflicts from the Middle East to Myanmar. People die over theological disagreements that most can't even explain. Politicians use religious identity to divide communities. Families split apart because members convert from one Abrahamic faith to another. Yet all of this division traces back to one fundamental question that we're going to answer today. Abraham lived around 2,000 years before Christ in ancient Mesopotamia. He wasn't born into monotheism. The world around him worshipped multiple gods, carved idols, and built temples to deities of war, fertility, and harvest. But Abraham received a revelation that would shatter this polytheistic worldview forever. He was told there was only one God, the creator of everything, and that this God had chosen him to be the father of nations. This wasn't just a personal spiritual experience. Abraham was commanded to leave everything behind, journey to an unknown land, and establish a new way of life built on monotheism. His descendants would become as numerous as the stars in the sky. They would carry this message of one God to the entire world. This was the birth of what we now call the Abrahamic faith tradition. Now here's where it gets interesting. Abraham had 2 sons who would each father nations, Isaac, born to his wife Sarah, and Ishmael, born to Hagar. Both sons inherited Abraham's monotheistic faith. Both were blessed by God according to the Scriptures. Both were promised that their descendants would become great nations. Yet, somehow, from this single family following one faith, we ended up with 3 separate religions. The key to understanding this split lies in one crucial concept that most people never consider. It's not about different gods or conflicting messages. All 3 faiths worship the same God of Abraham. They share the same core beliefs about monotheism, prophecy, and divine revelation. The fundamental difference comes down to one simple question. When did the line of prophets end? Think about it this way. Imagine you're following a GPS route, but different passengers in your car believe the destination is at different stops along the way. The first passenger says, "Stop at mile marker 50. The second says, "Keep going to mile marker 70. The third insists the real destination is at mile marker 90. Same route, same direction, but different endpoints. This is exactly what happened with the Abrahamic faiths. The first group, who became the Jewish people, trace their lineage primarily through Isaac and his descendants. They followed the teachings of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the long line of Hebrew prophets that followed. Moses received the Torah at Mount Sinai. David and Solomon ruled kingdoms built on monotheistic principles. Prophet after prophet delivered God's message to the children of Israel. But according to Jewish tradition, this prophetic line concluded with Malachi in the 5th century before Christ. After him, they believe, God stopped sending new prophets until the coming of the Messiah at the end of times. This created the first major split in the Abrahamic tradition. If you accept that prophethood ended with Malachi, then anyone claiming to be a prophet after that time must be false. This is why Jewish communities rejected later claimants to prophethood. It wasn't necessarily about the message itself, but about the timing and the belief that the prophetic era had already concluded. But not everyone agreed with this end point. A second group emerged who believed the prophetic line continued beyond Malachi. They accepted all the Hebrew prophets, but argued that God had sent one more crucial messenger, Jesus of Nazareth. This group, which became Christianity, viewed Jesus as the fulfillment of ancient prophecies, the promised Messiah who had been foretold by earlier prophets. For these early Christians, Jesus represented the continuation and completion of the Abrahamic faith tradition. He confirmed the teachings of Moses and the Hebrew prophets while bringing new revelations about salvation and the kingdom of God. The Christian scriptures, which they called the New Testament, were added alongside the Hebrew scriptures, now called the Old Testament, to form their complete biblical canon. But here's where it gets even more complex. Within Christianity itself, theological debates emerged about Jesus' nature. Was he purely human, a prophet like Moses? Was he divine, God incarnate? Was he both human and divine simultaneously? These questions would eventually split Christianity into numerous denominations, but the core Christian belief remained that Jesus was the final and definitive prophet in the Abrahamic tradition. Yet the story doesn't end there. 6 centuries after Jesus, a third group emerged with a different understanding of where the prophetic line concluded. This group, which became Islam, accepted all the Hebrew prophets and Jesus as legitimate messengers from God, but they believed that God had sent one final prophet to complete and seal the message that began with Abraham, Muhammad ibn Abdullah. According to Islamic teaching, Muhammad wasn't bringing a new religion, but restoring the original faith of Abraham that had been corrupted or misunderstood over time. The Quran, which Muslims believe contains God's final revelation, confirms the earlier scriptures while serving as the ultimate guide for humanity. In this view, anyone who truly follows the Abrahamic tradition must accept not just Moses and Jesus, but Muhammad as well. This creates a fascinating hierarchy of acceptance among the three faiths. Jewish communities generally reject both Jesus and Muhammad as prophets. Christians accept Jesus, but reject Muhammad. Muslims accept Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad as part of one continuous prophetic tradition. Each group draws the line at a different point, believing that their endpoint represents the complete and final revelation from God. But wait, there's something crucial we haven't addressed yet. If all three groups claim to follow Abraham's faith, what did Abraham actually believe in practice? This question cuts to the heart of our entire investigation, because if we can determine what Abraham's original faith looked like, we might be able to identify which modern religion most closely resembles it. The answer requires us to examine what the scriptures of all three faiths tell us about Abraham himself. According to the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Bible, and the Islamic Quran, Abraham was a strict monotheist who rejected idol worship completely. He believed in one invisible, all-powerful God who created and controlled the universe. He practiced prayer, charity, and hospitality. He was willing to sacrifice everything in obedience to God's commands. Most importantly, Abraham was told that his descendants would include a long line of prophets who would carry God's message to all nations. The scriptures indicate that Abraham himself expected and welcomed future prophets who would come after him. He didn't see his own revelation as the final word, but as the beginning of an ongoing relationship between God and humanity through chosen messengers. This raises uncomfortable questions for each of the three modern faiths. If Abraham expected future prophets to come after him, how can any group claim that prophecy ended at a particular point? If Abraham's faith was meant to reach all nations through multiple messengers, why would God suddenly stop sending prophets? And if Abraham's original faith was truly universal, why would it fragment into competing religions instead of remaining unified? The traditional answers from each faith community reflect their particular theological perspectives, but they don't fully resolve the historical puzzle. Jewish scholars point to specific biblical passages that seem to indicate prophecy would cease. Christian theologians argue that Jesus fulfilled all previous prophecies, making further prophets unnecessary. Muslim scholars claim that Muhammad was prophesied by earlier scriptures and represents the final completion of Abraham's mission. But here's what's really fascinating about this debate. When you strip away the later theological developments and look at the core message that supposedly runs through all these prophets, it's remarkably consistent. Worship one God, care for the poor and orphaned. Practice justice and mercy. Prepare for a final judgment where everyone will be held accountable for their actions. Expect that God will continue to guide humanity through chosen messengers. This consistency across supposedly different religions suggests something profound. Maybe the problem isn't with the original message. Maybe the problem is with how human institutions interpreted and preserved that message over centuries of political upheaval, cultural change, and theological debate. Consider what happens when you play telephone with a group of children. The original message gets distorted, embellished, and sometimes completely transformed by the time it reaches the end of the line. Now, imagine playing telephone across 4,000 years, through dozens of languages, countless wars, and the rise and fall of empires. Is it any wonder that Abraham's singular faith tradition ended up fractured into competing versions? But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Each of these three religions claims to have preserved the original message perfectly. Jews argue that the Torah contains the exact words God spoke to Moses, unchanged for millennia. Christians believe the Gospel accounts accurately record Jesus' teachings and actions. Muslims insist the Quran represents the precise revelation given to Muhammad, preserved letter by letter. Yet, when you examine the historical evidence, things get complicated fast. The Hebrew scriptures were compiled and edited over centuries by different authors with different perspectives. The Christian Gospels were written decades after Jesus' death by people who never met him personally. And Islamic traditions about Muhammad's life weren't systematically recorded until generations after his death. This doesn't mean these scriptures are false or worthless, but it does suggest that each religious community developed its own understanding of what Abraham's faith should look like, influenced by their particular historical circumstances, cultural contexts, and theological priorities. The question becomes, which version most accurately reflects what Abraham actually believed and practiced? Here's what makes this question so difficult to answer definitively. Abraham lived 4,000 years ago in a world completely different from ours. He didn't leave behind written memoirs or recorded speeches. Everything we know about him comes from religious texts that were compiled centuries or millennia after his death. These texts were written by his spiritual descendants. each group naturally emphasizing aspects of Abraham's story that supported their own theological positions. Jewish texts emphasize Abraham's special covenant with God and his role as father of the Israelite nation. Christian texts focus on how Abraham's faith prefigured the salvation that would come through Jesus. Islamic texts highlight Abraham's pure monotheism and his role as a prophet who submitted completely to God's will. All three portraits contain truth, but they're not identical portraits. The plot thickens when you realize that Abraham himself wasn't operating in a religious vacuum. He lived in a world where divine revelations, prophetic dreams, and supernatural encounters were accepted parts of reality. The idea that God would continue speaking to humanity through chosen messengers wasn't revolutionary in Abraham's time. It was the normal expectation. This raises a crucial question that most believers never consider. If Abraham expected God to keep sending prophets after him, and if his descendants were supposed to welcome and follow these future messengers, then what went wrong? Why did Abraham's unified faith tradition splinter into three separate religions that often view each other with suspicion or hostility? The answer lies in understanding how religious communities evolve over time. Every faith tradition faces a fundamental tension between preserving original teachings and adapting to new circumstances. When communities feel threatened by external forces or internal divisions, they often respond by becoming more rigid about doctrine, more suspicious of change, and more protective of their particular interpretation of truth. This is exactly what happened to Abraham's descendants over the centuries. The Israelites faced conquest, exile, and persecution that forced them to clearly define what made them distinct from surrounding peoples. Early Christians faced persecution from both Jewish and Roman authorities, leading them to emphasize their unique beliefs about Jesus. Early Muslims emerged in a polytheistic Arabian context where they had to distinguish their monotheism from existing religious practices. Each community developed what scholars call boundary markers, specific beliefs and practices that separated insiders from outsiders. These boundaries were often drawn in response to immediate threats or challenges, but once established, they became permanent features of each faith tradition. Over time, these boundary markers became more important than the original unified message they were supposed to protect. But here's what's truly fascinating about this historical process. Despite all the institutional divisions and theological disputes, ordinary believers from all three traditions often display remarkably similar spiritual characteristics. They pray to the same God Abraham worshipped. They struggle with the same moral questions he faced. They seek the same kind of divine guidance he received. This suggests that Abraham's original faith tradition isn't really lost or corrupted. It's still alive, but it's scattered across three different institutional frameworks that often obscure their common foundation. The essence of Abraham's monotheism, his trust in divine providence, his commitment to justice and mercy, these core elements continue to shape billions of lives today. Yet, the institutional divisions remain real and consequential. Wars have been fought over competing claims about prophetic succession. Families have been torn apart by conversion from one Abrahamic faith to another. Nations have been established and borders drawn based on religious identity. The practical consequences of these theological disputes affect real people in profound ways. This brings us to a critical question for our modern world. If Abraham's faith was meant to unite humanity under one God, how do we reconcile that original vision with the reality of three separate religions? Is it possible that all three communities preserve authentic aspects of Abraham's legacy? Or must we conclude that only one group truly represents his original faith? The traditional answer from each community is predictably self-serving. Jewish leaders argue that they maintain the most direct connection to Abraham through genetic descent and continuous tradition. Christian authorities claim that Jesus revealed the full meaning of Abraham's faith that had been hidden in earlier scriptures. Muslim scholars contend that Islam represents the restoration of Abraham's pure monotheism after it was corrupted by human additions. But what if they're all partially right and partially wrong? What if the fragmentation itself reveals something important about how divine truth interacts with human limitations? Maybe Abraham's faith was always meant to take multiple forms as it spread across different cultures and historical periods. This possibility challenges the exclusive truth claims that have fueled centuries of religious conflict. It suggests that God might work through all three traditions simultaneously, using their diversity to reach different peoples in different ways. The competition between Abrahamic faiths might actually serve a divine purpose we don't fully understand. Yet this inclusive interpretation faces serious theological obstacles within each tradition. If all three faiths preserve authentic aspects of Abraham's legacy, then none can claim exclusive access to divine truth. This undermines the authority structures and doctrinal certainties that hold religious communities together. It's a beautiful idea that's practically difficult to implement. The stakes of this discussion extend far beyond academic theology. In our interconnected world, the relationship between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam affects international politics, immigration policies, educational curricula, and countless personal relationships. Understanding how these faiths relate to their common Abrahamic foundation could provide a pathway toward greater mutual understanding and cooperation. But that requires honest examination of uncomfortable questions that each community would prefer to avoid. It means acknowledging that beloved traditions might contain human additions to divine revelation. It means recognizing that other communities might possess authentic insights that your own tradition has overlooked. It means accepting that absolute certainty about complex theological questions might be impossible this side of eternity. The journey back to Abraham's original faith isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's an invitation to rediscover what united his descendants before institutional boundaries divided them. That unity wasn't based on identical practices or perfect doctrinal agreement. It was rooted in shared commitment to the God who called Abraham out of polytheism into monotheistic faith. This shared commitment manifests differently across the three traditions, but the underlying spiritual DNA remains recognizable. When a Jewish person lights Shabbat candles, they're participating in the same rhythm of sacred time that Abraham would have understood. When a Christian kneels in prayer, they're expressing the same humble dependence on divine guidance that characterized Abraham's relationship with God. When a Muslim prostrates during daily prayers, they're embodying the same complete surrender that Abraham demonstrated when he was willing to sacrifice his son. But recognizing these spiritual similarities doesn't resolve the practical question that divides these communities. Each tradition claims that their understanding of prophetic succession represents God's actual plan for humanity. This isn't just about historical accuracy, it's about eternal consequences. If you follow the wrong prophetic line, according to each tradition's teaching, you risk missing God's final revelation and the salvation it offers. Here's where the evidence becomes particularly compelling. When you examine what each tradition's own scriptures say about future prophets, something remarkable emerges. The Hebrew Bible repeatedly promises that God will continue raising up prophets like Moses to guide the people. The Christian New Testament records Jesus himself speaking about prophets who would come after him. Even the Islamic Quran, while claiming to be the final revelation, acknowledges that God could send additional guidance if humanity needed it. This creates a fascinating paradox. Each tradition's own sacred texts seem to leave room for continued prophetic revelation, yet each community has decided that prophecy ended with their particular endpoint. The question becomes, did God actually stop sending prophets, Or did human institutions stop recognizing them? Consider what happened when Jesus appeared on the scene. He performed miracles, taught with unprecedented authority, and fulfilled specific prophecies about the coming Messiah. Yet the established religious authorities of his time largely rejected him. Why? Because accepting Jesus as a prophet would have required them to acknowledge that their understanding of God's plan was incomplete. It would have meant admitting that the divine story was still being written. The same pattern repeated when Muhammad began preaching in 7th century Arabia. He called people back to the pure monotheism of Abraham, performed what his followers considered miraculous feats, and claimed to fulfill prophecies found in earlier scriptures. Yet both Jewish and Christian communities largely rejected his prophetic claims. Again, acceptance would have required acknowledging that their respective traditions were incomplete rather than final. This historical pattern reveals something profound about human nature and religious institutions. Communities naturally resist prophetic claims that challenge their established understanding of divine truth. The very institutions created to preserve God's message can become obstacles to recognizing new expressions of that same message. This doesn't necessarily make the institutions evil or corrupt. It makes them human. But here's what's truly remarkable about the Abrahamic tradition. Despite all the institutional resistance and theological disputes, the core message keeps breaking through. Abraham's vision of ethical monotheism continues to transform lives across all three faith communities. The call to worship one God, care for the vulnerable, and live with moral integrity resonates across cultural and denominational boundaries. This persistence suggests that Abraham's original faith possesses an inherent power that transcends human attempts to contain or control it. Like water finding its way around obstacles, the essential spirit of Abrahamic monotheism continues to flow through whatever channels are available. Sometimes it flows through Jewish ritual and scholarship. Sometimes it flows through Christian worship and service. Sometimes it flows through Islamic prayer and community. The implications of this perspective are staggering. If Abraham's faith is bigger than any single institutional expression of it, then the competition between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam might be missing the point entirely. Instead of fighting over who owns the true version of Abraham's legacy, these communities might need to recognize that they're all participating in a single, ongoing divine project that began 4,000 years ago. This doesn't mean that all theological differences are meaningless, or that all religious practices are equally valid. Truth matters. Accuracy in understanding God's will matters, but it might mean that the truth is larger and more complex than any single tradition has fully grasped. It might mean that God uses diversity within the Abrahamic family to accomplish purposes that uniformity couldn't achieve. Consider how the three traditions have influenced world history. Jewish emphasis on education, law, and ethical reasoning has contributed immensely to human civilization. Christian focus on compassion, forgiveness, and social service has transformed countless societies. Islamic commitment to social justice, scientific inquiry, and global community has enriched human culture in profound ways. Would any single tradition have accomplished what all three have achieved together? But this raises uncomfortable questions about exclusivity claims that each tradition holds dear. If God truly works through all three Abrahamic faiths, then what happens to beliefs about salvation, chosen peoples, and final revelation? These doctrines have sustained communities through centuries of persecution and hardship. Questioning them feels like undermining the very foundations of faith itself. Yet Abraham himself faced a similar challenge when God called him to leave the familiar religious traditions of his ancestors. He had to choose between the security of established beliefs and the uncertainty of following a new divine revelation. His willingness to embrace that uncertainty, to trust God's promise even when he couldn't see the complete picture, became the defining characteristic of faith itself. Perhaps the fragmentation of Abraham's legacy into three distinct traditions reflects a similar divine strategy. Maybe God scattered the Abrahamic faith across different communities to prevent any single group from claiming exclusive ownership of divine truth. Maybe the ongoing tension between these traditions serves as a reminder that human understanding of God's will is always partial and provisional. This possibility becomes even more intriguing when you examine how the three traditions complement each other's weaknesses. Jewish emphasis on law and tradition provides stability and continuity that can balance Christian emphasis on grace and transformation. Islamic focus on submission and community can correct both Jewish particularism and Christian individualism. Christian emphasis on divine love and forgiveness can soften both Jewish legalism and Islamic judgment. None of these characterizations are complete or fair to the complexity of each tradition, but they illustrate how different aspects of Abraham's original faith might have been preserved and developed by different communities over time. The full picture of Abrahamic spirituality might only emerge when all three perspectives are considered together. This integration isn't just a theoretical possibility. Throughout history, individuals and communities have drawn insights from multiple Abrahamic traditions. Medieval Jewish philosophers studied Islamic commentaries. Christian mystics learned from Jewish Kabbalah. Muslim scholars preserved and transmitted Greek philosophy that influenced all three traditions. The boundaries between these faiths have never been as rigid as their official representatives sometimes claim, but institutional pressures continue to maintain separation, even when spiritual logic suggests integration. Religious authorities worry that openness to other traditions will confuse believers or weaken commitment to their own community's distinctive practices. Political leaders exploit religious differences to mobilize support or justify conflict. Economic interests sometimes benefit from maintaining religious divisions that create separate markets and constituencies. These practical considerations explain why Abraham's unified faith remains fragmented, despite theological arguments for integration. The problem isn't just about understanding God's will correctly. It's about navigating complex human institutions, cultural identities, and power structures that have developed around religious differences over centuries. Yet, something interesting happens when ordinary believers from different Abrahamic traditions actually encounter each other personally, rather than through institutional filters. They often discover shared values, similar spiritual experiences, and common concerns about moral and social issues. The theological differences that seem insurmountable in academic debates often feel less important than shared commitment to serving the God of Abraham. This grassroots recognition of kinship across faith boundaries suggests that Abraham's original vision of unified monotheism isn't dead. It's dormant, waiting for conditions that allow it to emerge more fully. Those conditions might include reduced political tensions between communities that identify with different traditions, increased personal interaction across faith boundaries, and growing recognition that none of the traditions has complete answers to contemporary challenges. The digital age has created unprecedented opportunities for such interaction. Muslims can read Jewish commentaries on shared biblical figures. Christians can study Islamic approaches to prayer and fasting. Jews can explore Christian interpretations of messianic prophecies. This cross-pollination doesn't require abandoning distinctive traditions, but it does require acknowledging that wisdom about God's will might be found in unexpected places. Abraham's faith was never meant to be a museum piece, preserved unchanged for historical curiosity. It was meant to be a living tradition that continues to guide humanity's relationship with the divine. That guidance might require the kind of flexibility and openness that Abraham himself demonstrated when he left everything familiar to follow God's call into unknown territory. The question facing contemporary Abrahamic communities isn't just about historical accuracy or theological correctness. It's about faithfulness to the spirit that animated Abraham's original response to divine revelation. That spirit was characterized by trust in God's promises, even when circumstances seemed to contradict them, willingness to sacrifice personal interests for divine purposes, and confidence that God's plan would ultimately benefit all nations. If Abraham's descendants in all three traditions could recapture that original spirit, they might discover that their apparent theological differences are less important than their shared mission to bring divine blessing to the world. They might find ways to cooperate in addressing global challenges that no single tradition can solve alone. They might even discover that their diversity serves God's purposes better than the uniformity they've sometimes tried to impose. But that discovery requires courage, similar to what Abraham demonstrated 4,000 years ago. It requires willingness to question comfortable assumptions, risk institutional disapproval, and trust that God's truth is bigger than human attempts to contain it. Most importantly, it requires faith that the God who called Abraham out of polytheism is still calling his descendants toward greater understanding of divine will. The stakes of answering Abraham's challenge correctly have never been higher. In our interconnected world, the relationship between Abrahamic traditions affects everything from international diplomacy to neighborhood relationships. Wars are fought over competing interpretations of shared sacred sites. Immigration policies reflect assumptions about religious compatibility. Educational curricula struggle to present these traditions fairly without offending any community's sensibilities. Yet beneath all these contemporary challenges lies the same fundamental question that Abraham faced in ancient Mesopotamia. Will you trust God's promise even when you can't see how it will be fulfilled? Will you follow divine guidance even when it leads away from familiar territory? Will you believe that God's plan is bigger than your current understanding of it? These questions don't have easy answers, especially when they're filtered through centuries of institutional development and cultural adaptation. But they're the right questions to ask if we want to understand how one man's faith became three religions, and whether those three religions might still share more than what divides them. The journey back to Abraham's original faith isn't about erasing the distinctive contributions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's about recognizing how each tradition preserves and develops different aspects of the spiritual vision that began with one man's willingness to trust an invisible God. That recognition might not eliminate all theological differences or resolve all practical conflicts between these communities, but it might provide a foundation for the kind of mutual respect and cooperation that Abraham's God intended when the promise was made that all nations would be blessed through his descendants. Whether that blessing flows through one unified tradition or three complementary ones might be less important than ensuring that it continues to flow at all. The answer to our original question, why Abraham's one faith became three religions, isn't just about historical processes or theological disputes. It's about how divine truth interacts with human limitations, how spiritual vision adapts to cultural circumstances, and how God's purposes might be accomplished through diversity rather than despite it. That answer challenges every community that claims Abraham as their father to look beyond their own tradition's boundaries and recognize the authentic faith that might be flourishing in unexpected places. It's a challenge that requires the same kind of trust and courage that Abraham demonstrated when he first heard God's call to become the father of nations. What happens when you follow that evidence? What happens when you trace the bloodline not just through family trees, but through the actual teachings and practices that were passed down? Because here's where this story takes a turn that nobody wants to talk about. The uncomfortable truth is that when you strip away centuries of institutional development and look at the raw evidence, one tradition emerges that actually matches what Abraham believed and practiced more closely than the others, and that discovery changes everything. Let's start with what we know for certain about Abraham's original faith. He believed in one God who created everything. He rejected all forms of idol worship. He practiced submission to divine will even when it required enormous personal sacrifice. He expected God to continue sending guidance to humanity through chosen messengers, and he believed that his descendants would carry this message to all nations, not just one particular group. Now here's what gets interesting. When you examine the three traditions that claim his legacy, only one of them actually accepts all the prophets that came after Abraham. Only one tradition teaches that the line of prophets continued unbroken from Abraham through Isaac and Ishmael, through Moses and David, through Jesus, and beyond. Only one community believes that God kept sending messengers exactly as Abraham expected. Judaism draws the line at Malachi. Christianity draws the line at Jesus. But Islam accepts them all. Every prophet recognized by Judaism, every prophet acknowledged by Christianity, plus the final messenger that both earlier traditions reject. If Abraham truly expected God to keep sending prophets to guide humanity, which approach actually honors that expectation? But that's just the beginning. When you dig deeper into what Abraham actually taught, the evidence becomes even more compelling. Abraham practiced what the Quran calls Hanif, pure monotheism without any partners or intermediaries. He didn't pray to angels or saints or any created beings. He directed his worship solely to the one invisible God who created everything. Which modern tradition most closely resembles this pure monotheism? It's not the Christianity that developed doctrines about divine persons and intercession through saints. It's not the Judaism that sometimes emphasizes ethnic identity over universal monotheistic message. It's the Islam that insists on worshiping God alone, without any intermediaries or partners. And here's where it gets really uncomfortable for critics. The Quran contains information that no 7th century Arab could have known. Scientific details about embryonic development that weren't discovered until modern microscopes were invented. Astronomical facts about the expanding universe that weren't confirmed until the 20th century. Historical details about ancient civilizations that weren't uncovered until archaeological excavations centuries later. How do you explain a text that describes the Big Bang 14 centuries before scientists theorized it? How do you account for detailed descriptions of fetal development that match modern embryology textbooks? How do you rationalize prophecies that have come true with stunning accuracy over the past 14 centuries? If Muhammad wasn't receiving divine revelation, where did this information come from? He was an illiterate merchant in 7th century Arabia. He had no access to Byzantine libraries or Persian academies. He couldn't read the scientific texts of other civilizations. Yet somehow he produced a book that contains knowledge that humanity only discovered recently. The skeptics have tried every possible explanation. Maybe he had secret teachers who shared ancient knowledge. Maybe he plagiarized from Jewish and Christian sources. Maybe he was just incredibly lucky with his guesses about scientific facts. But none of these theories hold up when you examine the evidence carefully. The knowledge in the Quran isn't just borrowed from earlier traditions. Much of it contradicts what those traditions believed at the time. The scientific information isn't just lucky guessing. It's too specific, too accurate, and too consistent to be coincidental. The historical details aren't just common knowledge. Many weren't known to anyone until modern archaeology uncovered them. Which brings us back to Abraham's original faith. If the Quran truly contains divine revelation, then its claims about Abraham must be taken seriously. And what does the Quran say about Abraham? That he was a Muslim. Not in the sense of following institutional Islam, but in the literal meaning of the word, one who submits completely to God's will. The Quran describes Abraham as a Hanif Muslim, a pure monotheist who submitted to God alone. It says he was neither Jewish nor Christian because those labels came centuries after his time. It presents him as the original Muslim, the prototype of complete surrender to divine guidance. This isn't just semantic wordplay. The Quran claims that Abraham's original faith was identical to what Muhammad preached. Same God, same message, same practices of prayer and charity and pilgrimage. The only difference was the specific messenger through whom the guidance came. If this claim is true, then Islam isn't a new religion that emerged in the 7th century. It's the restoration of Abraham's original faith after centuries of corruption and deviation. The Jewish emphasis on ethnic identity over universal monotheism would be a departure from Abraham's vision. The Christian development of Trinitarian doctrine would be a deviation from Abraham's pure monotheism. But here's what makes this evidence so compelling. The Quran doesn't just make these claims about Abraham. It challenges anyone who doubts them to produce similar revelations if they think human beings could have created such a text. It dares critics to find contradictions or errors if they believe it's just human composition. 14 centuries later, nobody has successfully met either challenge. The mathematical patterns woven throughout the Quran are so complex that they weren't discovered until computer analysis became possible. The literary structure is so sophisticated that Arabic linguists still can't fully explain how it achieves its effects. The prophetic accuracy is so consistent that even hostile critics have to acknowledge its remarkable track record. And then there are the manuscripts. The oldest Quran fragments date back to within decades of Muhammad's lifetime. They're virtually identical to the text Muslims recite today. Compare that to other religious texts that were compiled centuries after their supposed revelations, edited by multiple redactors, and preserved in versions that differ significantly from each other. The historical evidence for Muhammad's existence is overwhelming. Roman and Byzantine sources mention him. Persian records document his political impact. Archaeological evidence confirms details about 7th century Arabian society described in Islamic sources. There's no serious scholarly debate about whether Muhammad existed or whether he claimed to be a prophet. The question isn't whether Muhammad existed. The question is whether his prophetic claims were authentic. And when you examine the evidence objectively, without the bias that comes from existing religious commitments, the case becomes remarkably strong. Consider what Muhammad accomplished in just 23 years. He transformed a tribal society obsessed with poetry and warfare into a civilization that valued learning and justice. He united warring clans under a universal message that transcended ethnic and tribal boundaries. He established legal and social systems that protected women, orphans, and minorities in ways that were revolutionary for their time. More importantly, he did all this while claiming to be nothing more than a messenger. He never claimed to be divine or superhuman. He admitted his own human limitations and mistakes. He consistently directed worship and praise toward God alone, never toward himself. This isn't the profile of someone seeking personal power or glory. The community he established didn't just survive his death. It exploded across 3 continents within a century. Not through forced conversion, as critics claim, but through the power of its message and the justice of its social system. Christians and Jews living under early Islamic rule often found more religious freedom than they had experienced under Byzantine or Sasanian empires. This expansion wasn't random conquest driven by greed or tribal ambition. It followed a consistent pattern of offering 3 choices to opposing communities. Accept Islam, pay a protection tax while maintaining your own religion, or face military conflict. Most communities chose one of the first 2 options because the Islamic system offered them better governance than they had experienced before. The protection tax, called jizya, wasn't religious persecution. It was less than the taxes most communities were already paying to their previous rulers. and it exempted them from military service while guaranteeing their religious freedom. Many Christian and Jewish communities thrived under early Islamic rule, producing scholars, merchants, and administrators who played crucial roles in Islamic civilization. But the most compelling evidence for Muhammad's prophetic authenticity comes from the Quran itself. This text claims to be God's final revelation to humanity, the completion of the message that began with Abraham. It doesn't contradict earlier scriptures. It claims to confirm and clarify them. It doesn't reject Moses or Jesus. It honors them as authentic prophets whose messages were later corrupted by human additions. The Quran's treatment of biblical figures is remarkably consistent with the earliest sources about them, often more accurate than later religious traditions that developed around these figures. Its account of Jesus emphasizes his virgin birth, his miracles, and his role as Messiah while rejecting later theological developments that turned him into a divine figure. Its portrayal of Moses highlights his role as lawgiver and liberator while maintaining his essential humanity. Most significantly, the Quran claims that both Jewish and Christian scriptures originally prophesied Muhammad's coming. It challenges those communities to consult their own books for evidence of this final prophet. And when you examine pre-Islamic Jewish and Christian texts carefully, you find references to a prophet who would come from the descendants of Ishmael, from the wilderness of Arabia, with a message that would reach all nations. The Gospel of John records Jesus speaking about a paraclete, who would come after him to guide humanity into all truth. Early Christian interpreters understood this as a reference to a future prophet, not just to the Holy Spirit. The Hebrew Bible contains multiple references to a prophet like Moses, who would arise from among the brethren of the Israelites, a phrase that could refer to the Ishmaelite Arabs. These prophecies weren't invented by Muslim scholars centuries later. They exist in pre-Islamic manuscripts that Christian and Jewish communities preserved independently. The question is whether Muhammad fulfills these prophecies better than alternative interpretations that developed within those communities. When you examine the evidence without prejudice, the case becomes remarkably strong. Muhammad appeared in the exact region prophesied. He brought a message that reached all nations as predicted. He established a community that honored both Moses and Jesus while claiming to complete their mission. He produced a text that contains knowledge no 7th century human could have possessed. The implications of this evidence extend far beyond academic debates about religious history. If Muhammad was truly God's final messenger, then the Quran represents God's last guidance to humanity. The community he established, despite its later political divisions and theological disputes, preserves the authentic version of Abraham's original faith. This doesn't mean that individual Jews and Christians can't have genuine spiritual experiences or meaningful relationships with God. The Quran explicitly acknowledges that sincere believers from earlier traditions can achieve salvation. But it does mean that the most complete and accurate guidance comes through the final revelation that Muhammad brought. For contemporary believers struggling with questions about religious truth, this evidence offers both comfort and challenge. Comfort in knowing that God didn't abandon humanity to figure out spiritual truth through trial and error. Challenge in recognizing that accepting this guidance might require abandoning comfortable assumptions about religious authority and community identity. The fragmentation of Abraham's faith into 3 competing traditions wasn't God's plan. It was the result of human communities rejecting prophetic guidance that challenged their existing beliefs and power structures. The same pattern that led to Jesus' rejection by established religious authorities repeated when Muhammad appeared with claims that threatened both Jewish and Christian certainties about the end of prophecy. But the divine plan wasn't thwarted by human resistance. The final revelation was preserved and transmitted despite political opposition and military persecution. The community that accepted it grew from a handful of followers in Mecca to a global civilization that preserved and transmitted not just Islamic teachings, but Greek philosophy, Jewish law, Christian theology, and scientific knowledge from multiple traditions. This preservation wasn't accidental. The Quran explicitly promises that this final revelation would be protected from the kind of corruption that affected earlier scriptures. The fact that 14th century Quran manuscripts are virtually identical to 7th century fragments suggests that this promise has been fulfilled in ways that didn't happen with other religious texts. The mathematical patterns encoded in the Quran's structure serve as a built-in authentication system that makes unauthorized changes detectable. The memorization tradition that preserved the text orally alongside written manuscripts created multiple verification systems. The global distribution of the text across diverse cultures and languages made systematic corruption practically impossible. These preservation mechanisms weren't available to earlier revelations. The Torah was transmitted through a small community that faced repeated conquest and exile. The Gospel was preserved by communities that faced centuries of persecution before gaining political power. Both texts show clear evidence of editorial development and theological interpretation that reflected later community concerns. The implications of this evidence can't be dismissed by claiming that all religions are equally valid paths to God. Truth claims matter. Historical accuracy matters. If God truly sent a final revelation to complete and correct earlier guidance, then ignoring that revelation isn't just a personal choice. It's a rejection of divine guidance itself. But recognizing Muhammad's prophetic authenticity doesn't require condemning everyone who follows other traditions. The Quran acknowledges that God could have made all humanity one community if that had served divine purposes. The diversity of religious traditions might serve educational functions that uniformity couldn't accomplish. What it does require is honest acknowledgement that the evidence points toward one tradition preserving Abraham's original faith more accurately than the others. That tradition isn't perfect. No human community ever is, but it maintains the essential elements that made Abraham's faith revolutionary: pure monotheism, prophetic guidance, universal message, and complete submission to divine will. The 3 billion people who claim Abraham as their spiritual father face a choice similar to what their ancestor confronted 4,000 years ago. Will they follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it challenges comfortable assumptions? Will they trust that God's guidance continues even when it comes through unexpected channels? Will they recognize authentic prophecy even when it disrupts established religious hierarchies? Abraham's choice to leave familiar religious traditions and follow divine guidance into unknown territory established the pattern that his descendants are still called to follow. That pattern doesn't guarantee easy answers or comfortable conclusions, but it does promise that those who seek divine guidance sincerely will find it, regardless of which community they start from. The question isn't whether God loves Jews, Christians, and Muslims equally. The question is which community has preserved and transmitted God's final guidance most accurately. The evidence suggests that answer isn't what many people want to hear. But truth doesn't depend on human preferences or cultural comfort zones. Abraham's unified faith didn't disappear when it fragmented into 3 traditions. It was preserved and completed in the final revelation that God sent through Muhammad. The task facing contemporary believers isn't to create artificial unity between incompatible truth claims. It's to recognize authentic divine guidance when it appears, even when accepting it requires leaving familiar territory. The stakes of this recognition extend beyond personal salvation to global civilization itself. The challenges facing humanity today, environmental destruction, social inequality, international conflict, moral confusion, require the kind of comprehensive guidance that only authentic divine revelation can provide. Human wisdom alone isn't sufficient for problems that threaten the survival of civilization itself. If God truly sent final guidance through Muhammad, then ignoring that guidance isn't just individually harmful, it's collectively catastrophic. The solutions to humanity's greatest challenges might be found in the text and example that most of the world's religious believers have never seriously examined. But examining that evidence honestly requires the same courage Abraham demonstrated when he smashed his father's idols and proclaimed monotheism in a polytheistic society. It requires willingness to question inherited assumptions, risk social disapproval, and trust divine guidance over human tradition. The fragmentation of Abraham's faith into three competing religions wasn't the end of the story. It was preparation for the final chapter where authentic guidance would be distinguished from human additions. That chapter is still being written by every person who encounters the evidence about Muhammad's prophetic claims and decides how to respond. The choice facing contemporary believers is ultimately the same one Abraham faced: trust human tradition or follow divine guidance, maintain comfortable assumptions or embrace challenging truth, preserve existing community boundaries or join the universal community that God intended from the beginning. Abraham's descendants who make the same choice he did will discover that his original faith isn't lost in the mists of ancient history. It's alive, complete, and available to anyone willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads. But that discovery requires leaving the familiar territory of inherited assumptions and venturing into the unknown landscape of authentic divine guidance. The journey from Abraham's one faith to today's three religions reveals both human limitation and divine persistence. Human communities consistently resist prophetic guidance that challenges their established beliefs. But God consistently provides that guidance anyway, through messengers who call people back to the pure monotheism that Abraham first proclaimed. The final messenger in that series didn't bring a new religion. He brought the completion of Abraham's original faith, preserved in a text that serves as humanity's last chance to unite under the guidance that God intended from the beginning. Whether that chance will be seized or squandered depends on choices that billions of people are still making every day. So here we are, 4,000 years after Abraham first heard God's call in ancient Mesopotamia. 3 billion people worship the same God, honor the same patriarch, yet remain divided by walls that seem impossible to tear down. But maybe that's exactly the point. Maybe the division itself was always part of a larger plan we're only beginning to understand. The evidence points toward one uncomfortable truth that most believers don't want to face. Abraham's original faith wasn't lost when it split into three traditions. It was preserved, completed, and sealed in the final revelation that came through the last messenger God sent to humanity. Whether we're ready to accept that evidence or not, the choice remains the same one Abraham faced 4,000 years ago. Will you follow where the truth leads, even when it means leaving everything familiar behind?